So let's plan less. The other shoe was bound to rest. The head leads us on its way. We're sticking to our guns. We've got a chance to make a difference in this life. But I wonder if you're leading me on. And don't you wanna be tired of all these things, scared of living in the past? And don't you wanna be free from all you see, not scared it won't last? We're sticking to our guns. We've got a chance to make a difference in this life. But I wonder if you're leading me on. We're sticking to our guns. We've got a chance to make a difference in this life. But I wonder if you're leading me on.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the 12th in our series of the Future Plymouth 2030 webinars. If you're a regular, you won't recognise me. My name's George and I'm from Glow Digital. So without further ado, I'll tell you what's on today. So today our focus is health and wellbeing. We're going to hear from Tunde, Agoro and Katherine, Adair from the Hoare Lea Partnership. They're going to introduce us to wellbeing principles and methodologies for assessing these in the context of the built environment. Then we'll listen to Roger Higman from the Network of Wellbeing. He's going to discuss how healthy building and environments mean healthy people and planet. Then we're going to hear from Mike Westley from the University of Plymouth. He's going to explain why the green and blue infrastructure of external spaces is so important to our wellbeing from a design perspective. So first up, we've got Tunde and Kat. They're going to be setting the scene, defining well-being, making a case for considering the impact of buildings and the built environment. We're also going to delve into measuring well-being and the assessment methodologies that can be utilised for buildings in the UK. Before I pop them on screen, just to remind you guys, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom, so pop it in there or pop it in the chat. So if there's anything interesting that Tunde or Kat talk about and you have a burning question, please ask. And whilst the webinar is going on, do tweet along with us, use the hashtag FP2030. And if you can, follow us on all of our social media channels and say what a wonderful time you had today. So first up, I'm going to put Kat and Tunde on.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
All right, fabulous. All right, it's great to be here. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you 1 second. Just bear with me and we should get started in a second. So Georgina, thanks for that introduction. As Georgina mentioned, my name is Tunde and I'm here with my colleague Katherine. We're both from Hoare Lea Sustainability Group. And I have been in the world of sustainability consulting now, going to about 10 years. And well, being in the built environment probably twice as long. And interestingly, started my journey as an architect. In the world of sustainability, I'm perhaps one of those you might refer to as a generalist. So I've got my fingers in quite a number of different pies. So net zero carbon, circular economy, social value, and of course, health and well-being, which happens to be one of my favorite topics. So it's great to be a part of a Future Plymouth 2030 discussing health and well-being. So as Georgina mentioned, myself and Kat, we just want to set the scene for the rest of the speakers today. So our presentation today is broken into three very succinct parts, if you like. So the very first part is why well-being. I mean, it's a great place to start with why. And then we'll go on to how. How do you measure well-being? And then Kat will further go on to buttress this with a few more facts and insights from a building that we've been involved with. So to get things started, I would like to invite you to imagine for a moment. I want you to imagine a future where buildings are one with humans, where our buildings are in total sync with our internal body clock and circadian rhythm, where our buildings can understand our vitals and can respond, to how we feel, and with the advent of big data and more intelligence buildings, I dare say the future of well-being in terms of the built environment is personalized. And also, it's clearly established that humans, we are social animals. And because of this, we gravitate to places, spaces, and products that make us feel good. With the global pandemic, this has now included places that make us feel safe. And even more importantly, it's about places that make us feel well. And because of this, priorities are changing, and they are changing at every level imaginable. And it's the reason why we can no longer design buildings and spaces and places just for the environment. We must design with people in mind. We must design for our physical, our mental, and our social well-being. But what does that really mean? Well, I think if there's any organization that should know what that means, is the World Health Organization. And they provided a very succinct definition. And they said health and well-being is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And we're becoming more informed than ever. Now, wearables have paved the way for this. Our increased access to internet, smartphones, smartwatches, Fitbits, and lots of news in the media as well. And even more particularly in these times, COVID has actually spiked the interest, in health and well-being, and of course we've got lots of whispers about an emerging vaccine passport. Okay, we're just throwing a little bit of controversy out there, but people expect data, and we will hear a bit more about this, later on today. Still talking about COVID as well, it has put quite a lot of emphasis and the crosshairs on indoor air quality and the importance of good ventilation within built spaces. We know that the external air quality and in terms of external air pollution, we're not going to solve that problem, overnight. And emphasis will continue to be on indoor air quality and how we reduce our exposure to pollution. We are drawn to nature. Now, that's a phenomenon which is referred to as biophilia. It's our innate attraction and proclivity, for the sounds of, water, the colors of greeneries and all sorts of things that are natural. And we know that there's a plethora of evidence that shows that this delivers immense benefits to us. We know that biophilia and being close or immersed with nature can increase rate of learning in educational facilities, productivity and creativity in the workplace. It can increase sales even within the retail environment and improve recovery rates in healthcare facilities. Overall, we know that integrating nature into the built environment can increase the value of our assets. Therefore, we must harness the power of nature. Or, as a minimum, we must incorporate substantial elements of it in our designs. And for example, the Genesis building here in Plymouth is a case in point, with respect to that. And again, we will talk a bit more, about this subject, further speakers will talk a bit more about this, later on today. So to come to a close, and we've said it before, and we would like to say it again, the value of place will be driven by wellness. And what this simply means is that the most productive, the most sought after, the most valuable places will be those that are first human-centric, secondly, that best connect us with nature, and finally, that best optimize our well-being. So how? I'd like to hand you over to my colleague, Katherine, to take you through this.
Thanks, Tunde. I'll just switch over to my screen. So
okay,
I've got control.
Go for it.
There we go. So yeah, thanks, Tunde. That's a really useful introduction. So I think the kind of point I think that's being made is that health and well-being is really important, and there's a lot of value in having buildings that are designed with health and well-being in mind. But I suppose the kind of question is, like, how do you measure this design? How do you measure human-centered design? How do you measure health and well-being in buildings? Because it isn't always about, it's not about how much energy you're using. It's not about always that kind of quantifiable data. So, but it's still nonetheless really important to be able to measure and kind of show that how health and well-being is being incorporated. So there are thankfully a couple of, or a few assessment methods that can be used for health and well-being that are currently out there to be utilised in the built environment. So the two key assessment methods I think that are kind of most widely used at the moment in the built environment is the Well Building Standard and Fitwell certification, which are both USA-based standards, but are both kind of more and more widely used in the UK context. They cover very similar elements, so they both cover health and well-being, but they just have a slightly different approach. Well is a little bit more data-driven and a little bit more detailed, but can often be more complex to implement, whereas Fitwell provides a slightly higher level approach, is more accessible, and kind of focuses more on the non-technical aspects of kind of designing for health and well-being. So just to give a little bit of context, so worldwide, there are kind of hundreds of projects certified against each. It's about 400 for well and 660-ish for Fitwell. But there's plenty of registered projects, plenty of professionals that are certified in help supporting the implementation of these assessment methods, so well APs and global users of Fitwell. And there are kind of multiple countries around the world that are kind of using this standard. In the UK specifically, it's the last couple of years has seen quite a rapid, especially in the last year, or year to 2 years, has seen quite a rapid uptake in the UK. So there are a lot more registered projects now, but still a kind of a smaller number of certified projects. But that's purely, I think, more just because those registered projects are still going through the assessment stages, and that will all become certified. I think in the next couple of years we'll see a lot more kind of coming and being fully certified. So that just kind of gives a little bit of a background to how it's currently looking in the UK. In terms of the focus areas that these assessment methods look at, they cover similar. So they both cover things like indoor air quality, water quality, food choices, lighting, fitness, comfort, thermal comfort, or kind of acoustics, biophilia, all sorts of things, and both have different levels of achievement that you can get depending on how well performing your building is. The key thing for well, they focus, as I mentioned before, a lot on measuring data. For example, there's a lot on indoor air quality monitoring your kind of VOCs in your indoor air quality, ensuring that is kind of a high level. Things about testing your water quality, things like measuring the circadian lighting in a building and the lighting design as well, to make sure that is comfortable for users, whether that's in an office or in a residential setting, and things like thermal performance. There's a lot of measurement that is done. With Fitwell, again, they're similar themes, but in a slightly different way. They kind of focus more on things around the layout of the building and the kind of spatial planning. So there's a lot more about kind of building location, how accessible sites are, whether there is provision for public transport or cycle facilities, those kind of elements, kind of encouraging people to get active and kind of making the healthy option, the easy option, I suppose, is really the kind of the way that they approach the assessment. And that kind of goes into inside the building as well. There's kind of requirements around making sure you have accessible stairwells that kind of people will want to use, having a kind of an indoor smoke-free environment. And then for both of them, there's also things around ensuring that food that is provided is healthy food, and there is access to kind of a healthy food option and healthy and clean water. In terms of how they're both assessed, I kind of goes similarly to what I was saying before, in that they're quite similar, but there's a key difference between well and Fitwell, is that you register the projects in both. You kind of do a document review of kind of the designs of the building and the kind of the intent of the design team and the developer. But a key thing with well is that there is that performance verification stage that is not included in Fitwell, and that's where you have to show, if in your document review stage you're saying that we're going to have fantastic air quality or fantastic thermal comfort, you have to then go and test that post-construction and say, these are the levels of air quality we are showing, and you've got to meet certain levels. And that kind of verification stage is somewhat absent in Fitwell. The benefits of having that stage is that you can get real tangible results. It's easy to I suppose market how well your building is performing and to communicate that with stakeholders. The drawback with that is that it can make it less accessible for either smaller developments or kind of buildings that have some kind of difficulty, such as a listed building or refurbishment or something, where if you aren't able, for example, to kind of put in a very complicated air filtration system for whatever reason, it can kind of limit you somewhat onto how well you can perform, whereas Fitwell takes a more flexible approach, so that there are elements that you can test, and you can test your air quality to a kind of a slightly less stringent level if that's something you can do with your project. But the focus is really on making sure that the base design of the building is a healthy design, and that the intent is there for how the building is going to perform. The key thing with both of them, though, is that you have to recertify every year. So it isn't just a case of a building certifying when at the end of a project and saying that they meet the well requirements or meet the Fitwell requirements. They then have to recertify every 3 years. So if there is testing, if there are operational requirements in place for kind of, you know, allowing flexible working, or those kind of elements, you have to show that that is continuously done throughout the operation of the building. So what that means is that it makes it a little bit more, it provides an additional verification process and an additional step that means that you can have confidence that these buildings are going to be healthy for as long as they have certification. It wasn't just a design stage, kind of construction stage promise that isn't necessarily followed through. So I'll just do it a little bit. We've done a few we've had a few well projects that kind of going through this process now, that are now kind of in construction and completed. So I just give it a little kind of insight into the kind of design elements that go into, in this case, a well building. So it can be things like having visible stairs to promote use over lifts. So instead of having your stairs hidden away in kind of a back kind of core or kind of like closed off between doors, having things like the stairs accessible near the building entrance, or even having kind of a glass wall just to see, so people can see where they are and encourage them to be used. Just making sure that their, you know, hallways and staircases are designed so that people want to use them, whether that's having natural light, artwork, the inclusion of biophilia to encourage walking, views out, those kind of things all encourage people kind of almost subconsciously to want to be active and want to use those and improve their health and their well-being. Having workstation flexibility, for example, you know, being able to have sit-stand desks are elements that you can kind of get benefit from in the well certification, and the inclusion of things, areas like having relaxation or quiet areas, or areas that, you know, are for collaboration, so that you can choose in an office space, in this example, how you utilize your space, and it kind of provides a more inclusive working environment and provides more flexibility for how people want to use their space. Having internal lighting to reduce glare is another key element that is utilized, and having good acoustics, so reducing sound reducing doors and ceilings being specified, and also importantly making sure that building materials, finishes and furniture have low VOC content, which can improve indoor air quality and can kind of reduce the possibility of respiratory issues in building users. Having filtration on incoming air supply, so making sure that kind of fine particulate matter that is quite especially common in city centre locations from traffic and kind of that kind of stuff, making sure that is filtered out so you're not breathing that in every day, especially if you're kind of near a main road or something like that. And also having air quality monitors throughout, so making sure that, as I mentioned before, you're not just measuring at a set point in time, but that air quality is being constantly looked at and constantly monitored, and making sure you have things in place like kind of good ventilation rates, or potentially including openable windows ventilation to make sure that that is kind of a flexible design to depending on the context of your project. So there are, as well as the design elements of well and Fitwell, there are also operational elements that need to be considered, which kind of focuses more on the operation between that period of initially certifying and recertifying in 3 years' time. So there are requirements and incorporate elements such as providing nutritional education for building users. So whether that is either providing access to fresh kind of fruit and veg, if that is an option, but there is some flexibility. So if you can't do that, instead you can just provide education so people have the tools that they need to make their own healthy choices. Having access to physical activity options, like, if you're lucky enough to have a yoga studio in your office, something like that, like just making sure there is access to options for people. Again, if there's not space on site, you can provide kind of things like subsidized gym membership for off-site or local gyms. That kind of stuff can also provide benefit in the well assessment. Very important, I think, at the moment is having rigorous cleaning protocols, including things like deep cleans, but also making sure that the cleaning material products that are being used are non-toxic. So again, making sure that you're not kind of causing any respiratory issues when you're kind of doing regular cleaning. Encouraging things like a healthy work-life balance, making sure that you have enforced break and holiday entitlements, having stress management plans and education for employees. And again, just having regular occupant surveys to, again, just keep an eye on how everyone is feeling in that building, and making sure that you have process in place if there needs to be improvement is very key. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how a well building has kind of had an effect on some occupants. There's some kind of feedback here that we've had from a well certified building that people are finding, so 63% in this particular case think that their environment within this well certified building helps them to work more productively. Over 80% think that their work environment was very efficient and easy to use, had really good lighting levels in the building, and 96% felt like this working environment was kind of clean and well maintained, which is great. So it's pretty. There's lots of benefits that you can show from having those things in place, and there are definitely tangible outcomes that people have found from working in these buildings. And finally, just a few other stats for you that from moving offices, there kind of people found that in terms of acoustics, that working environment was significantly improved from before this new office was implemented. Same with the cleaning and freedom to choose their work settings. People were much happier with their flexibility once moved into this new environment. And again, just being able to keep active and having access to nature within the building and also outside the building. So this just gives a little illustration to you about how implementing certification such as well on a project can really kind of lead to real world kind of tangible outcomes for people. And that's it. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you guys, that was brilliant. So if anybody has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A, pop them in the chat, and just let us know what you're thinking about. If there's anything you wanted to ask from that. I think for me, the big thing I took mentioned about being immersed in nature. And what the positives for that. So in terms of learning, in terms of productivity, but actually in terms of sales and shopping. So that was quite interesting as well. So yeah, if you do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. The guys would love to hear from you. So next up, we have Roger Higman. So Roger is the director of the Network of Wellbeing, a network of people who are passionate about wellbeing and its implications for public policy. He's going to speak about what makes us well and how we can live better coming out of the pandemic, especially in reference to Plymouth, where he lives. Roger also has a poll for us, so you'll see that popping up on your screen as well during the presentation. So I'll just hand you over to Roger.
Brilliant, thank you. Georgina, and very pleased to meet you all here today. And very different experience from I think the last time I did a public talk, but it's good. It's good to do these things. My name is Roger Higman, as I said, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. So I'm just going to. That's what I want. And I want to do set up the slideshow. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that, and hopefully if you can't see that, Georgina will give me a message very quickly to saying so. As I said, my name is Roger Higman. I'm director of the Network of Wellbeing, and I'd like to talk to you maybe to broaden the focus a bit from what Tunde and was talking about, and Katherine was talking about, to cover the built environment as well as buildings. But first, I'm going to say a little bit about the Network of Wellbeing and introduce generally what I'm going to talk about. As Georgina said, we're an organisation of people. We're based in Totnes, but we have a national focus, and we're really what we have is a shared vision about the importance of well-being for society and the importance of being well and looking after one's well-being, and the importance that society as itself should focus on people's well-being rather than necessarily other goals, which I'll come on to in a minute. We run events, we run our own webinars, which you can see in the screen there. We also run some projects in Totnes, including what we believe to be the first world's travelling library of things. Libraries of things, if you don't know, like libraries, but you can, instead of borrowing books, you can borrow tools or chocolate fountains or carpet cleaners, anything like that. There's also one in Plymouth called Borrow Don't Buy. So I'd urge you to check it out and have a look and see ways you can improve your well-being by getting access to stuff that maybe you haven't got the money to buy or haven't got a place to store wherever you're living. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about well-being in the built environment. Not really buildings. I'm not an architect. I'm not qualified. I feel a bit of an interloper in that respect, speaking here. But I'm going to talk about the built environment, what's needed from a well-being point of view, what we get with a particular reference to Plymouth, and maybe what we need to do over the next 30 years in the light of some of the changes that are happening in the world to try and get better environments that people can properly thrive and live properly in. Okay, so first things first, what's well-being? Well, many years ago, when I first got this job, I thought I'd look it up on Google Images. It's the easiest way of finding out what a word means. And what I came across were an awful lot of images that look vaguely like these. And so what you can see is that well-being is the feeling that you get when you stand in a meadow on a bright sunny day, lift your arms up into the air and just look at the sky. And that is essentially what people tell you is the feeling of well-being. And I noticed it was interesting that Claire or whoever chose the photograph for this event also included, as soon as we talk about well-being, we're talking about an arm lifting up in the air and people feeling happy as a result. Actually, it's slightly more complicated than that. There's dimensions. It's not the same as happiness. There are dimensions of past, present, and future in it. And a brand of psychology called positive psychology done an awful lot of investigation into what makes people happy and what makes people well. And that's sort of informing quite a lot of this. There's elements of the past in the sense of how satisfied we are with one's progress in life, whether we're scarred by things that have happened in our past. There's elements of the present in terms of our mood that can go up and down, but what the balance of our mood, whether we're mainly happy at a given moment or mainly sad, or even worse, possibly depressed, or even worse, possibly suicidal. And then there's one's view about the future. Are you actively hopeful? Are you thinking the future is going to be better for you, or are you fearful? Are you thinking that maybe you've had the best you're ever going to have, and that life is going to get worse for you and the people you care about in the future? So it has very, very complicated elements within our minds about how we see the world and our relation to it. It has a huge sort of track record, a history. There's a huge human interest in well-being, going back all the way to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, of all people, wrote about well-being and what makes for a good life. And he distinguished between various concepts, and he noted that it wasn't just a question of being happy and living life, doing the most pleasurable things that you could do. There are also elements of living a meaningful life and living a purposeful life, doing things you believe in, things that make you feel satisfied. At the end of the day, when you get to, as Frank Sinatra wrote, the final curtain, you did it your way. and that you actually lived the life you wanted to lead. And so there are a very complicated set of issues around physical health, social well-being, spiritual health, emotional sense of thriving and flourishing. Finally, it's worth noting, particularly for individuals, it's not something you can just achieve. It's something that comes as a result of all the things you do. So what do we know about what makes people happy and what makes people well? Well, as I hinted earlier, there's a huge amount of information from positive psychology. Tens of thousands of different studies have been done in the last decade about this. And then there's the whole body of philosophy and religious teaching that we can draw on to find out what leads people to be happy and what makes for a good life. And about 10 years ago, an organization called the New Economics Foundation were asked by the Treasury to pull all this together and say, what does it mean in terms of what an individual can do? And they noted that actually there are limits to this. Approximately, I think 60–70% of your happiness and well-being over life is probably genetically determined. If you're a naturally unhappy person, it may be difficult to get over that. But that there is scope for us all to do things that make us happy and to actively look after our own well-being. And the New Economics Foundation identified 5 things in particular that seem to make a difference. And they developed what was called the 5 ways to well-being, which some of you may have seen. Those things are: be active, physically active, do things. The more you move your body around, the more fit you are, generally speaking, the happier you're likely to be. Connect with other people, do things with other people. Don't just stand on the sidelines. Engage with other people. The more friends you have, more relationships you have, generally speaking, the more satisfied and more happy you are with your life. Learn, keep on doing new things you haven't tried before. Learn, maybe go back to college. It's one of the most important ways of improving one's well-being, but also learning more generally, trying up new hobbies, new crafts, that sort of thing. Give of yourself and your time seems to be an important one. Actually doing things you believe in to make the world a better place. We all have a sense of community, we all have a sense of society, and for many, many people, actually giving something back is tremendously important. And then the final one, possibly the most complex one, is the idea of taking note of yourself and your surroundings. And this is all to do with mindfulness, and this is all to do with a huge amount of evidence that says that if we actively look after our own well-being, if we do take steps deliberately to make us feel happier, our well-being will be improved in the future. And one of the things I wanted to sort of stress at that point, and it's the reason for the choice of all these pictures, is that an awful lot of the things that we associate, if you like, with civic life, with community activities, with the voluntary sector, charities, this sort of stuff, that people do are incredibly good for their well-being, whether it's going on fun runs with your friends, walking, joining a walking group, learning to dance, maybe practicing a bit of art, having a shared meal with friends, gardening, all those sorts of things are tremendously important. And that's why we encourage people to build well-being together, to think of well-being as something that you achieve by working with your other people in your community, your friends and your family. And the more you can immerse yourself in that, the more likely you are to be happy, which is also, of course, why it's important that we have a proper work-life balance, because we spend all our time working. Very often we find that we haven't actually achieved those other things in our lives that we need to achieve to make us well. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of the built environment, in terms of planning for well-being, in terms of what architects and planners can do to make it's all a condition for all of us to be happier than we are at the moment? Well, there are various things I try to identify here. And I think one of the first and most important things that we've got to identify is that we're very privileged in Plymouth. We're very lucky that we live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, that we live in one of the most stable countries in the world. There are people out there in other parts of the world, people like Syria or Yemen, whose whole livelihoods have been trashed, or their safety has been compromised because of war or because of natural disasters. And all of those sorts of things are extremely bad for well-being, as can be imagined. People who are tremendously poor, having to struggle daily to work very long hours to achieve the basics of what people need to survive, they also tend to suffer from very, very poor well-being. And we're relatively well off, and therefore, as a stable society, it's relatively safe to go out and do things much safer than it would be in other places to go out and do things. We don't fear for our lives every time we have to go to the shops. So generally speaking, we live in a very, very secure place and a very, very stable society. And that is extremely good for well-being. And it's very important, and this is relevant in terms of what I'm going to say later, that we maintain that. The second thing I think I wanted to talk about, though, was that within our society, the built environment plays a crucial role in maintaining and enhancing our well-being, because it's where many of the civic activities that I've just talked about happen. So everything from Tai Chi in the park through to meeting one's friends down in the centre of Plymouth, to going on a bike ride with a pal or something down by a river or something like that, or going off the allotment, taking the kids to a play park. All of those sorts of things happen in the built environment, happen in the public realm. Even getting access to most of the nature that most of us get access to happens in the built environment, in the areas around which we live. And so it's tremendously important that those areas are designed with well-being in mind. But what I want to argue next is actually what we often get isn't that. And there's a reason for that. And I think it's quite important that we also look at that reason. And what we get instead is what I tend to think of as temples, and temples of consumption, Drake Circus being a case in point, temples of leisure. I mean, huge complexes where we're all drawn in to watch something, like the View Cinema Complex or the new one they've got, the Barcode, often surrounded by very, very large car parks. So the idea is that you drive in, you access the facility, you then maybe spend a lot of money on food at the same time, you then go back into your car and you drive home to your private residence. There are also temples of health, large gym complexes, temples of well-being, country clubs that people drive out to. Now, all of these places are private spaces. They've all been designed with essentially private profit in mind, and they've all been designed, therefore, to try and get as much money out of people as possible for as little engagement. And they're not naturally, they vary, but they're not naturally the best places for social interaction. They're not naturally the best places for interaction for people who haven't got the sort of money that are required to go to the cinema together, or sit in a restaurant together, or go to a gym and so on. They're also, in many cases, very, very large. And as a result, people have to travel distances to them. And that has implications for the rest of our built environment. That means that we get a lot of traffic generated by it. And as a result, the other parts of our built environment that are important for well-being are often dominated by cars, lorries, and vehicles moving around. I would recognise, and I ought to say at this point, that I think there are some temples, if you like, that are very, very good in Plymouth. Things like the Life Centre, the new box that Plymouth City Council's created. But the principle is, and there's been real efforts there to try and create public spaces that everybody can access. But the principle I'm trying to get to is that rather than thinking of well-being as something that is delivered by one of these temples, we need to think of well-being that is delivered throughout the built environment, through the streets in which people live, through the ordinary small places that they interact. Okay. And before I go on to talk about that in more detail, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the context in which we've got a plan for the next 30 years and the future of Plymouth. And I mentioned two different things that I think are absolutely critical to this discussion. The first one is inequality, because we live in a very, very divided world. And we've seen a lot of that in terms of the pandemic. And you're familiar, I'm sure, with these sort of two worlds of the pandemic that people are talking about. On the one hand, you've got huge numbers of people, including many of ourselves, I'm sure, who are working either from home or from much, much, much depleted offices, probably saving quite a lot of money and time in travel costs, possibly having different interactions with people, with family that we never had before, and possibly quite enjoying this. On the other hand, you've also got people, maybe a whole group of people, who are doing essential services that are supporting us by bringing deliveries, by bringing in, making sure that food is stocked up in the supermarkets, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm sure you're all aware that it's the latter group that by and large has suffered from the illness more than the former group, and that many of the people in that latter group are very, very badly paid. As a result, there's a very, very stark income distribution in terms of the people who died from the pandemic and suffered from the pandemic. And that the reason I draw attention to that is that that's one aspect of a much broader trend about economic the distribution of benefits of income in society that has a critical effect on well-being. Our job prospects leads to differences in incomes, and differences of incomes lead to even larger differences in terms of wealth. That means some people can afford very, very good houses with gardens. Some people can afford more than one house, a holiday home maybe. Other people maybe can't afford the house at all and can't necessarily afford to travel on holiday. And that actually has an impact, not just on people's day-to-day well-being, but people's life expectancy. And you can see that in Plymouth, and many of you, I'm sure, will have seen this before, based on one that was done in London, but it's also true of most British cities, that you can draw diagrams showing differences in life expectancy along a given bus route. And in some cases, in this case in Plymouth, the differences between one side of Plymouth and another is as much as 10 years. And so people who are on lower incomes are dying earlier than people on higher incomes and probably living poorer quality of lives for the time they are alive as well. So that is a massive issue that has been exacerbated in my lifetime since the 1970s when I was growing up. And it's continuing to widen those income differentials. And that is something that as a society, we have to find a way, if we're going to tackle well-being, of trying to turn around and actually have a more equal society where everybody's contribution is met properly. The second big issue I wanted to draw your attention to is the ecological crisis, because whatever we do, as I said at the beginning or early on, a stable society and stable livelihoods are absolutely essential for well-being. And if we continue to pollute and to damage the life support systems that underpin ourselves as a species and our economies, we are going to jeopardize that economic stability and that social stability that we need, not just in the United Kingdom, but even more so in other countries in tropical areas where already we're seeing the impact of climate change on people's livelihoods and lives. And that means that there's an imperative all the way through this to try and get to net zero as quickly as possible and to try and restrain the other aspects of our consumption that are leading to chemical pollution, biodiversity loss, land system change, and all the different other areas in which planetary boundaries are being overstepped. So what does that then imply for the built environment? Well, I think I wanted to draw attention to two things before I close. The first is about rethinking the public realm and moving away from those big out-of-town developments that we've got at the top of the screen there. That's Marsh Mills. The sort of developments that by and large are privately owned with car parking spaces. And those of you who are familiar with will probably aware that the only way you can get from one part of the site to another is to drive. We need to move away from that sort of thing and move the focus away from that sort of thing and to focus much, much more locally on what we can do to boost well-being locally. And that's about moving away from new build, because most of the buildings, virtually all the buildings that we need over the next 30 or 40 years have already been built. It means we can't afford, because of the ecological issues involved, to demolish all the buildings that we've got now. We have to live with the buildings we've got, which means that we've got to think of in terms of retrofit and so on. And so the two things I wanted to draw your attention to, though, about that was firstly, and I think it's going to be dealt with a bit more later, is firstly this issue of the public realm between the buildings which people live. And here's Mutley Plain, for example, absolutely dominated by traffic, priority given to movement of vehicles. We know, and I think it's going to be brought out in the next talk, we can do an awful lot better to encourage active forms of travel. We can do an awful lot better to encourage and create places on street that are meeting spaces, activity spaces that people can take exercise on, people can meet each other, do social activities on. Secondly, I wanted to draw attention to, again, we need to rethink the buildings we've got, but whereas there will be some new buildings, and Bickley down at the top there is a fine example of an new eco design, most of the activity is going to be in retrofit. And while there are some good examples of retrofit, and the picture in the middle there is a Plymouth Community Homes retrofit development with energy efficiency and solar power, I think funded through the I can't remember the exact scheme it was, but there's some good examples of that. In Plymouth, there are tens of thousands of buildings that are 100 years old or more that people are going to be living in for the next 20 or 30 years that haven't been retrofitted. And the example, I think, the picture at the bottom is a case in point. It looks like Plymouth. It's not Plymouth, it's actually Brighton, but it could equally be Plymouth. You've got thousands and thousands. My understanding is there's something like 60,000 single-skinned dwellings in Plymouth. The story behind that picture is that lady spent £37,000 on upgrading that building back in 2011 to make it incredibly energy efficient to try and prevent climate change. In the time since then, we've had virtually zero progress on actually making single-skinned buildings more energy efficient. And that's something that we have to try and get better on, because if we don't, we're not going to reduce the emissions from those properties. And so I think that's a case where we need to learn from the pandemic and think, look at the response that the government did there. And I can see this in my own organisation where, we were given, because we have rateable value, a property of rateable value, we were given a £10,000 grant with zero questions asked, but when we had to close it down because of the pandemic. We need to be giving that sort of money to almost every owner of a property like that in order to get their houses more energy efficient. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to depend hugely on natural gas with all the implications that has. The good news is that could be done if it's with a scheme that would create huge numbers of green jobs and huge numbers of employment, or not just in one or two places in the country, all over the country. So there's a real potential there as part of the Green New Deal to do that. Finally, I just want to say the last thing I wanted to say, which is that all of this, I think, leads us, the consideration of well-being leads us to question why we're putting so much emphasis on economic growth. Because we know that the emissions that we've saved in this country over the last 30 years have been more than made up by increases in emissions because of our consumption from emissions elsewhere. We've not stopped consuming. We're actually consuming more than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And as a result, our emissions in other countries, because of the purchases we've made and the things we're buying into the country, have increased our overall environmental footprint. Yet there's huge amounts of evidence going back over 20 years that the materialistic lives that we lead actually make us miserable. People who are more materialistic, more concerned with getting their happiness from buying things, more concerned with going shopping, tend on average to be less happier than people who pursue less materialistic values. And so there are alternatives, and we've developed some of those alternatives at the Network of Wellbeing. But I wanted to just put a question in the strategies that Plymouth is adopting as to whether we really need to focus on more of these temples of growth where we're consuming so much, where we're celebrating the new developments that are happening, and whether we should be putting more emphasis instead on retrofitting the many thousands of properties that we've got and making the public realm a much more pleasant environment in which to walk and ride a bicycle. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was brilliant. I think one of the key things that you just said there about materialism making people miserable, I think one of the charities you mentioned right at the beginning, Roger, and I'll unmute you for this, so Borrow Don't Buy, it's a great charity where you can, instead of buying something brand new, so maybe you want to go cycling, you can borrow a bike, or you can borrow a TV or a toaster or whatever it is. It's a wonderful charity that actually combats something like that. And one of the other interesting things I think you were talking about is retrofitting all of the older houses. So it's just really interesting, and hopefully we'll get a lot of questions. I'm just hinting to everyone. So if you do have any questions, pop them in the Q&A, because I think Roger's talk there was really interesting about things that we can all do and start to think about. So finally, we move on to Mike Westley. So thank you for waiting, Mike. So he's going to be presenting wellbeing from the performance infrastructure point of view. He's going to be focusing on multidisciplinary design approaches aimed at delivering well-being from multifunctional, performative green and blue infrastructure. He'll call for greater value being placed on and greater investment in the everywhere landscape of the interstitial spaces, as well as more traditional green space. So I won't get tongue-tied again, and instead I'll just hand over to Mike.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Yeah, listening to the previous two amazing presentations, I'm left kind of feeling that I'm the third part of that old adage, which says if you really want someone to listen, then you've got to tell them what you're going to tell them, you've got to tell them, and then you've got to tell them what you told them. And I think I'm just about to tell you what the other guys have just told you, but I don't mind. That's fine. My name's Mike Westley, and I'm a landscape architect. I'm director of Westley Design Limited. We're landscape architects and inclusive designers. I've taught for an improbable 25 years at the School of Architecture at the University of Plymouth. Nationally, I work for the Design Council as one of their built environment expert panelists specializing in health and well-being. Regionally, I sit on various design review panels, and locally, I spend as much time as possible in my garden gardening. When it gets a bit warmer, I like to throw myself in the sea, and when it's not blowing a hoolie, I like to get out on my faithful old Drascombe lugger and sail around a bit. And that's personally how I'm fortunate enough to be able to look after my own well-being. This afternoon, I would like to share with you a vision for, I guess, how we can all be more successful in spreading the message of well-being and the wider environment. I asked George who we're likely to meet online on these kind of sessions, and she said, well, you know, generally they're people very, very supportive of these issues. In many ways, of course, we all want the people who we need to make arguments to be sitting there. But I think it's vital for all of us to recognize that as change makers, we want to be vested with the arguments to successfully make those arguments for change to our clients, to politicians, to the communities we work in. And so I hope that what I'm going to do finally this afternoon is to run through a bit of context for this whole notion of well-being and the built environment. I'm a landscape architect, and I'll be dealing with that at the very end of the presentation, but showing how I believe we can't stand inside our own disciplines. We have to work in a multidisciplinary and an engaged and a nested way with other professionals, with a variety of communities. And now I'm going to try and get this slideshow going. So from the beginning, there we go. Great, it's actually worked. Hope you can all see that. George, sing out if you can't. So, I should say that the notes I'm about to read from will be available embedded in the PowerPoint presentation you're about to see, so don't worry if they don't appear on it. I think if we needed reminding that we're part of nature and not apart from it, then COVID has reminded us just how accurate E.O. Wilson's thesis of biophilia really is. I think we need to be reminded continually that our fellow creatures and the natural green and blue and synthetic grey environments which we inhabit are all deeply impacted by our unknowing and sometimes uncaring actions. We've also got to be reminded that we're social beings, like these sheep, unable to get into their usual McDonald's. And perhaps we can learn to value that society which we've missed so much, and that public realm in which we engaged very much more in the future. Pippi Longstocking, famous story character and resplendent on this wall in Freiburg, reminds us that, and I hope I'm translating correctly, we make the world the way we like it. Perhaps post-COVID, we have to make a clearer perspective, or take a clearer perspective on what that might mean for us now. The climate emergency has reminded us that if we wish to have a livable future in which to make that world, we better get down to work and make it fast. There really is no time for halfway houses. But I think key to that is recognizing that we've got to involve the whole human community in making that an inclusive possibility. We've got to produce an equitable state of well-being, because we need to be not only skilled change makers designing and helping to manage that change, but we also need to be skilled in contributing to the inclusive design and management processes that are required to bring that change about, working with stakeholders, working with the communities. There's a definition of well-being, which I think goes to the heart of this fine balance that we're trying to create when we work with people and all their different interests. So I think we need a way of approaching this question of well-being which deals with reality. And I would argue that fundamental to that is health. And if we are to deal with health rather, then we need a different model. So far, we've dealt with and tried to deal with issues of health and well-being via what might be called the treatment-based model of healthcare. But what we need perhaps is something that deals with something more about the total human being, because we seem to spend more and more money on healthcare, and yet we're no happier, we understand by surveys. So why isn't our well-being increasing? And the pictures on the left-hand side of your screen represent where we spend our money proportionately as nations, as individuals through our taxes in keeping healthy. And down the bottom, it will be revealed shortly, where we might spend more of that money, how we might recast healthcare and well-being. These projects that we see illustrated on the left show small examples, in this case from near me, near Penryn in Cornwall, and up in Roger's neck of the woods more in Totnes. Different examples of projects involving people which deliver the kind of processes which Roger spoke about, and which deliver resilience against the kind of economic and social and environmental stresses which challenge our ability to resist dis-ease. We need to be focused more on the quality of how and where we live our lives, as Pippi Longstocking would say, how we make our world. There's a kind of telling bit of evidence here, not much kind of comfort for someone experiencing cardiac problems already, but just the cost of these individual operations that we conduct routinely in the NHS might be avoided, and that money spent on creating better places to keep us healthier. So what's the situation at the moment? What's the context? Well, this is the very marvelous and well-respected Michael Marmot's Fair Society, Healthy Lives, the Marmot Review, produced now 10 years ago. And it looks at all of those key factors which impact on our health as a nation, as communities, and as individuals. We can see there, down there at point E in the 6 policy objectives that he calls on us to address, create and develop healthy and sustainable places and communities. That's where the public realm sits. That's where we're being challenged to address. This is 10 years ago, remember, being encouraged in total to achieve a fair society, conditions in which individuals and communities have control over their lives. So it's not just about environment, it's about engaging with people so that they can be their own solution. I guess COVID has reminded us again, more than anything else, that we can't build walls of privilege around our lives. As Roger was kind of pointing out, we need to care for the whole world community, otherwise it'll come back to bite us. And the built environment, which concerns us today, is front and center in that role. I'm sure many of you will recognize Hugh Barton and Marcus Grant's famous diagram, looking at the nestedness of the environment in which we sit, how the inputs and the outputs that we use and that we create make our place, make our world, and need to be part of our everyday decisions. It shows how we are nested in our environment with surrounding communities, with nature, with economies, international, national, regional, and local. There is no escape. We are connected. But this isn't new. We've known about this. The research body, a body of research, by the wonderful folk like Kaplan and Ulrich, environmental psychologists, and cross-disciplinary studies by the people mentioned here, have all proved that environment is key to well-being. We need to address all aspects together. There really is nothing new, and we've got no excuse for not acting now. In sitting in on the recent HIP2 conferences, the health improvement conferences, looking at how we can better design and deliver health services and environments, I was reminded of this document produced when I used to work for the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And there, looking at those goals that we can see there, I recognize goals that we set out in HIP2 or agreed in the feedback from HIP2 9 years ago, 11 years ago now. It's not that we don't have either the understanding of these issues, it's not that we don't have the research backing them up. I would suggest that we haven't acted on it with sufficient commitment. The time to act is now. And every one of us listening to this, every one of us delivering these webinars needs to feel that we have a stake, not only in our personal response to these challenges, but also as advocates, as proselytizers for this new approach and the urgency with which we must address it. Again, 2009. Here we've got a wonderful health champion from Plymouth setting out a 20-year vision of well-being that he believes could be achieved in Plymouth based upon this model that he's looking at, that's been up and running successfully in Freiburg for some time already. It still is. Regularly visit it with my students from the university. So we don't lack champions. We don't lack inspiring precedents. Where are we now? Well, sadly, when Michael Marmot reviewed his review and the status of all of those different key trigger levels 10 years on, we find a pretty dismal message. Investment down. Austerity has taken a toll, not only of our ambition to keep changing positively, but it's also taken a hit in terms of health and well-being. And we see that acted out and manifest in the built environment. This aspect of his report just focuses on environmental quality and high streets. and looks at three different criteria here: the number of cigarette butts, the amount of unacceptable litter, and the presence of dog fouling. It shows the level of diversity in wealth across the nation, the inequity with which we address at the moment our built environment. And as we've said before, and as Michael Marmot suggests, and as our experience in COVID suggests, inequity, a postal code lottery, will never work. We need to address these situations equally with equity and with innovation. We need to involve people in their own solutions. We need to build more equitable relationships between people and place. Equally, we know that we've got to connect issues. We know that we can't deal with one issue in a vacuum. Everything must be interconnected. And although we've got these great examples of greener transport systems in Denmark, these studies of how green infrastructure affects the economy coming out of Sheffield Hallam, we know that although local authorities like the wonderful London Borough of Barnet carrying out these corporate natural capital accounting, looking at how green space in particular delivers benefits to people, that we must look at all aspects together. We must be open and work in a multidisciplinary way. If there has been in the past, interprofessional barriers need to go. We need to be sharing hands across the professions and maximizing what our change capacity is when working together. Even on massive issues like climate change, we've got to be able to deliver a message which says that there is a benefit, a clear benefit to the people we're asking to invest in this vision and to, on their own part, help deliver the vision. And here at Western Harbour in Malmo, that vision and that shared understanding of the issues is taking place. Anyone who's been there can see and feel the way in which such environments, new, old, process of change, changed, are stronger if they're gathered around key belief systems in the change that we're trying to bring about. We don't lack guidance, and in many ways, I hope my presentation and the references that are attached to it will help people in terms of making these arguments. This particular piece of work, wonderful piece of work by Public Health England, is an umbrella piece of research drawing together research carried out by academics and professionals within key areas affecting the built environment. In each one of them, it makes definitive and well-referenced proposals for how we can make changes in those areas and for the particular health benefits that will result. It backs that up with the actual research itself, and critically with lists and lists and lists of case studies that we can turn to prevent ourselves having to reinvent the wheel. So whether it's food and environment, whether it's housing, neighborhood design, sustainable environment, transport, all of these areas, Natural Health England have researched, contain definitive research which provides comprehensive evidence that improving the environment in these areas has a direct benefit on human well-being, economic, social, cultural, and environmental. So I urge you all to look at this report and to begin to hopefully utilize its results. I suppose fundamentally this wonderful example of a competition winning entry on how to design a housing block in Malmo shows how we must be multidimensional and multi-layered in our consideration of the green environment, of green infrastructure, of blue infrastructure, how it must work on a number of different levels, and each of those levels be integrated. In this simple set of diagrams, it shows how from all variety of different possibilities, we can integrate different aspects of society which contribute to sustaining our well-being. And crucially, it involves, although these images relate to projects of Westley design rather than this one, it involves people in delivering that solution. So they are pulling forward their own solutions to improved environments and well-being. This important and innovative piece of work, research work by Dr. Sarah Bell, looks at how, irrespective of all those wonderful practical and pragmatic and physical methods of changing our environment we've been looking at, we mustn't forget that this whole experience of well-being is rooted in the human psychology and subconscious. And Sarah, in her work, has begun to enrich our understanding of the quality of positive experiences which green and blue infrastructure can have. Why? To help us respond in a more nuanced and accurate way to the design and management of those environments. Remember always the importance of human experience in place. That relationship and relevance of the wider environment, green and blue infrastructure, a cognizance of the benefit that's accruing to the individual, is the way that we have of guaranteeing buy-in to what we're trying to argue for, of guaranteeing support, of guaranteeing people who go out there and are their own ambassadors for change. So in conclusion, I'd like quickly to run through two documents that I'd also like to recommend to you, and which are available as free PDFs, downloads from the net. They're both produced by the Landscape Institute, the UK Landscape Institute. One is on green infrastructure per se, and the second on green infrastructure and well-being. And I helped to produce the second one, and there'll be some case studies in there as well. Basically, what this first report asks us to do is to not look at green spaces as liabilities, as maintenance liabilities, which is so often the case, but to look at these sometimes everywhere spaces as assets, as potential change-making environments that can deliver benefits through their functions. The important thing to understand is that each of those spaces can be multifunctional, can mean different things to different people, can be multi-layered to deliver an inclusive relevance to a whole community. And this report hopefully provides some of the tools and skills to enable us as change makers and people in their own communities to deliver these multi-layered and nested spaces. And so it runs through all of the different benefits which we can get: health benefits, economic benefits, and for each of the different subjects it addresses, again, provides case studies. So much that hamstrings us in taking this movement forward is not connecting up the dots, not sharing the information, not sharing the success stories. These documents help to do that. They also come up with key recommendations for the different actors, the different change makers who we work with routinely and who need to be engaged. I'm sure there are people from all of these different walks of life present on this webinar, or that we deal with them in our everyday lives. These recommendations are there for them to play their part, but they're also there to guide us in dealing with this kind of actor, this kind of change maker, incipient change maker, to help us work with them to make the change. So this is the second of those publications. Again, much abridged. I recommend you read it. It actually takes a set of different principles for what makes a space healthy, for how it can impact us, particularly from different aspects of our health and well-being. And its first principle is, how do we make spaces that improve air, water, soil quality, and help us to adapt to climate change? Again, a whole raft of case studies, a whole set of possible methodologies for attacking that, for applying it to the different sites, places, from our gardens to our wider spaces, to our transport networks. How do we turn them into places that fulfill that function? Those principles might well be shared by principle 2, healthy spaces that overcome health inequalities, going back to Marmot, and improve healthy lives. It's critical that people don't perceive green space as being something for them over there, but not for me. The third principle is for places that make people feel comfortable and at ease, increasing social interaction, and it might have said cultural interaction there as well, antisocial behavior, isolation and stress. I recently worked with the children's home in Plymouth, and I asked the director what the major factors he felt that he fought against daily were. And he said fear of the environment. Kids stay in, parents keep kids in because of perhaps an unreasoned fear of what the outdoors poses for them. We've got to have places which are owned by, which feel a sense of ownership to each one of us and which we feel safe in, invested in. Critically, that doesn't stop where we're just enjoying ourselves in green space. The principle 4 is of healthy spaces that optimize opportunities for working, learning, and development. We spend most of our lives at work. We should be loving the places that we live in, and they should be supporting us to do our work more effectively. Finally, going back to those issues tackled in Sarah Bell's innovative diagram, healthy spaces are restorative, uplifting, and healing for both physical and mental health conditions. I remember working for CABE how we developed an inclusive design tool called Space Shaper. And one of the questions we fought to keep in that methodology was, does this place inspire me? Now, I don't know how many of us feel that we have a right for the public spaces that we enjoy to inspire us, but maybe we should. Maybe we need to have that degree of investment in place. This report follows up with recommendations in the same way for how to take this forward practically. I'm sure I've overstayed my welcome, but I'd just like to say in conclusion that if nothing else, I'd like to take away the plea that we all become more skilled in understanding the knowledge base that we already have in this area, that we become more enlightened as to the wonderful case studies that are all out there for us to provide to those people that we need to convince. The tools are already out there. All we have to do is work in partnership together, I believe, and work urgently to make this change happen. Thank you very much. Still awake?
Wonderful.
Good.
Thank you very much. That was really, really good. One of the things that we missed doing is Roger has a poll for us, which is about to pop up on your screen now. So you should all see the poll. Yeah, and whilst you answer that, if you guys do have any questions, that would be amazing. We are about to do our Q&A and I can see quite a few coming in, but if there's anything that you guys want to ask any of our speakers, anything you want to see again or go over, or anything that you thought was particularly interesting and you just want to comment to say how great it was, please do. Wow. I'm just watching the results of the poll come in. It's actually really interesting. You'll see in a second. I shouldn't give anything away. I'll just wait for a couple more of you to vote. Wonderful. So the poll should now pop up on your screen. So the question was, what things do you do to maintain your health and well-being? And it was a multiple choice poll, and I won't give it away in case you have a delayed internet, but you should be able to see that most of you take exercise, which is pretty exciting. And I think, you know, over lockdown, that's kind of what we were all doing to occupy our time. So that's really interesting, actually. And also a lot of you have now gone back to the gym. Perfect. So we'll move on to our questions now. If you haven't managed to put one in, you can always raise your hand or just pop a question in, because it could be that somebody else's question bounces off and you think, that's a question I'd like to ask on that. So we'll start off with the first question from Ruth, which is, can the focus on indoor air quality help reduce exposure to the ozone? And I think if I just unmute the speakers, one of them will dive in with an answer.
Hi, George. I'll take it. I think I'm just gave a little of detail to Ruth, I think, already. But so I think yes, the focus on indoor air quality can definitely help reduce exposure to ozone. It's a bit of a tricky one in the sense that the main kind of or one of the main reasons you get ozone is through fossil fuel burning and things like kind of cars and lorries. So the main way where you get kind of that damaging ozone is from external factors that you don't necessarily find in the built environment, indoors. So I suppose the kind of obviously the ideal situation is we would remove the cause of it, which is obviously the burning of the fossil fuels. But in terms of monitoring our indoor air quality, if we're monitoring that regularly and we've kind of got best practice ventilation in our buildings, and that is able to kind of look at how our air quality is changing over time, and we can address those issues as we go, it means that we can, even if kind of external air quality is poor, we can still help to reduce our exposure indoors by making sure that indoor air quality is kind of regularly flushed out and kind of regularly filtered to make sure that is reduced. Because I mean, we spend most of our time indoors, so it is important to make sure that we can improve those ventilation rates, and it's one of those things that I suppose that what I kind of feel at the moment is that the focus on indoor air quality is more on VOCs that you kind of get from I think furniture and paints and particulate matter, I think are really the ones that people talk about the most, but the ways that you reduce those are very similar, and that will by default also reduce ozone by making sure you've got your good ventilation and those kind of areas. So it's one of the things that ozone is measured in the Well Building Standard, so it is kind of seen as an important area of focus. Oh, I think.
Yes, go, Mike, go.
I just wanted to fly a flag for all the green stuff out there in terms of air quality. I mean, critically in cities, and we saw this in Tunde's and Katherine's wonderful presentation. Green walls, tree planting inside our buildings. Plants can do so much to both trap particulate pollution, to improve the quality of the air, to totally sort of transform, I think in many cases, our experience of the outdoors in cities. So a plea again, not just to build walls and better filters, but to look outside and address issues of air quality at a primary level. Of course, I guess Roger would argue that we didn't ought to be creating the unhealthy air problems in the first place by using non-carbon pollution producing infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. But certainly there are a raft of ways of delivering mitigation, which also make our cities more beautiful.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. The next question is from Sarah. She's asked, has the COVID pandemic provided enough of a shock to society to make people sit up, take notice of all the evidence and reports that have been around for more than a decade about the importance of health and well-being in our buildings and the built environment? And is there a chance that it will get better now?
Well, I started talking about COVID, so I'll just have my 5 pennies worth very quickly. There are sense on a day-to-day basis with people around me and with people that I engage with professionally from all different backgrounds that perhaps, you know, we've just been missing a trick all this time, or that we haven't been as aware as we might have been of the seriousness of the issues. And I think that was what I was trying to get to by that slide of the clear water in the Venice canals. You know, the ways in which birdsong became louder. It touched us in ways that are very human, that go to the heart of that relationship, that biophilic relationship, that whether we like it or not, that we have with nature and with the world around us. My only plea is that we can carry on making that message loud and clear when everyone's had their vaccination and when everyone's opened up and gone to the pub and are so happy with other sort of dopamine substitutes that we might have forgotten about it. We need to hang on to these lessons, and part of my plea is not to be a doom monger, but to say, look at the potential for having this benefit with us all the time. If only we can stand in that worldview, that different worldview, and preserve the achievable concessions that we achieved during lockdown to that better relationship with nature and the environment around us. So it's our job to keep that agenda present.
I think, Tunde, do you have something to add to that one?
Yes, Georgina, I was just going to say that's a fantastic question there from Sarah, actually. I would like to believe that it has. I mean, the number of deaths, I mean, I don't want to rehash those numbers, just depressing. And we definitely don't have an alternative. We must build better. And I think lots of us on this, you know, webinar would have heard or seen the Build Back Better movement. And I think we need to shout it, scream it, amplify it. And we have seen that lots of clients that we're working with, that they have taken notice of it, you know, and it's starting to shift and shape priorities, you know, in terms of what outcomes are anticipated in new developments going forward, even existing, you know, projects, you know, opportunity to retrofit them, to incorporate more and more of nature into it is key. I mean, we've seen people living in flats and city centers without access to nature suffer severely, you know, from this lockdown, and it heightened, you know, that importance and that link that we so much intrinsically yearn for with nature. You know, it's really obvious now, and I think I think the answer is we don't have a choice. There is no alternative. It has to get better.
Yeah, agreed. So our next question, and I think this one is aimed at you, Roger, but if any of our other speakers want to say anything, please leap in. The question is, how do we change communities' opinion on change? And those who shout the loudest don't want it. As you say, it's disturbing, and lots of these initiatives have not been completed within our cities and towns, and we need to educate.
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question, because I mean, I think one of the things about people who in their own communities, they always know their communities better than anybody else, and obviously very few of them have been to Freiburg, and I remember sort of, Michael, hearing people coming back from places in the Netherlands, places in Denmark, places in Germany in the 1980s, you know, and where this work was being done, and thinking this is marvelous, we have to learn from it, and we haven't in this country, and it's because I think by and large people feel very strongly that they know their communities better, and they don't think what's going over there is relevant, and I think that's a great shame. In terms of how we can do it, I think I agree with Michael that scaring people is not the way forward. I think we have to demonstrate a better way of living and a better way of doing things, and I think, you know, in the traffic sense, there's always the sort of feeling that, well, if it works in Oxford and Cambridge, well, it's not for Plymouth or Rochdale. And I think we need to demonstrate, look, it's working everywhere now. Those traffic changes, it's working in the places people that are like Plymouth. I think it's worth demonstrating, you know, all the different things that we could do positively to make life better, and the people who live in these ways are actually living better lives and enjoying themselves and more happy. And I think we've seen that in the pandemic with the enthusiasm there is to get into nature, the enthusiasm there is, you know, to sort of spend time outside. I think an awful lot of people are realizing right at the very core of their being that they need those natural environments now in a way maybe they haven't in the past. And so in that sense, there's no real alternative to sort of doing it and demonstrating it and encouraging people to follow suit.
I agree. So I think it's all about benefit. It's all about showing how this stuff isn't just some kind of altruistic stuff that we're doing for everybody in general. It's about showing how it can impact, you know, beneficially on your life, on our individual lives, economically, socially, environmentally. You know, why else would anyone be expected to take this stuff on? We've got to make the argument about personal benefit to the people that we're asking to, you know, to be part of this change. It has to be real for them, and it has to be demonstrable. And that's why I think, in particular, it's really important that we follow up on projects, that we share lessons of projects, that we connect different stakeholders and clients and communities involved in projects to share lessons about benefits, to build a tide of people going, why wouldn't you? That's what we've got to create. We've got to create a presumption to engage with these issues, a presumption to change because of the benefit that we know we're going to get. You know, that's what I think.
Well said. Put it better than I could.
So the next question we have is the government offering any funding to support well-building and development? They're asking because often there are visibility issues that limit the scale of developer contributions, in particular Section 106. This helps us deliver a lot of wellbeing improvements. In your experience, is there scope for developers and/or their funders to contribute further via a corporate social responsibility type of scheme? That one perplexed you guys.
I'm wondering about Tunde.
I know, I was just going to say something. Yeah, it is. That's a really interesting question, and I think what I would say to that is the driver for such initiatives tends to be more client side, more industry led as opposed to policy or government led. So we're not seeing any sort of incentives, in terms of financial or economic, from policy or regulation, in that regard. But we are seeing gradually a change in terms of policy position to encourage more consideration for enhancing, protecting biodiversity, greening the urban environment. So case in point, the new London plan has introduced 2 key policy requirements, including urban greening factors and biodiversity net gain targets for major developments in the city. So I think that's probably what policy can do, to keep pointing in those sort of strategic directions. But I suppose in terms of for us as industry members of professional industry members, and for clients and developers, we need to take the ownership of driving it, and wanting to see change, and yeah, I think it's the right thing to do. So it's almost like a moral, ethical question, if you like. So, and I think whoever asked, I can't remember who asked the question, whether it was Sarah as well, but you mentioned corporate social responsibility. So again, it goes back to the social purpose of organizations, and giving back to community, I suppose.
I think there's an element of benefit here as well. If one looks, and I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to look across the channel again, at the amount that in some other countries people are paid for the energy which they can generate on their houses to sell back to the grid, and the variable and inconsistent approach which UK governments have adopted in respect to this over the last 20 years, it is no wonder that we're so poorly served in the planning legislation and in terms of the amount of provision and the cost of it, of actually generating energy or heat through PVs or solar heating. We're just not incentivized to do this. There's no carrot and there's no stick, because I'm afraid that central government sees a value in the large energy producers getting their stake, getting money from their shareholders, more than they see benefit in requiring developers to implement solar, to implement PV, to implement ground source heat pumps everywhere. That needs to be the carrot. That needs to be the stick rather, but the carrot is that people will want those properties to live in because they can sell the energy back to the web, the net, and get benefit from it because they can have better heated houses, cheaper heated houses, they can escape fuel poverty. So it's a big circle that so far the UK has been unable to join. So as the Neville brothers said, may the circle be unbroken. Let's link that, benefit, carrot, stick, just on energy for a start. That'd be a good thing, in my view.
So tediously, I'm going to link what you've just mentioned from our friends across the channel to our next question. And this doesn't link in any way. I'm just trying to make it link. But our next question has asked, they're saying they're surprised at the wellness assessment methodologies are American and that they expected them to originate from Scandinavia. Do any of you guys have any thoughts or opinions on that?
I was going to come in on that one because I think I'm not that surprised actually. And there's some very positive things coming from the United States, and we should remember that an awful lot of the positive psychology originated there. I mean, so many of the best positive psychologists in the world are American, so this thinking is very strong over there, and it's really impacting on the way they look at their built environment. I think the other thing they've to remember is also possibly something we can learn from sometimes maybe the Scandinavians. I remember seeing a program for young men, young boys really, who maybe fallen astray a bit in their development as teenagers in, I think it was Finland, and they were talking about it from a wellbeing point of view, and they asked how they measured it, And they said at the end of their hope was at the end of the session, about 6-7 weeks of training and everything like that, each of the boys would have a hobby. And the English people were looking at it aghast, thinking, well, hold on, surely there must be more KPIs than that. And no. And what I think what happens in many cases in some of these, some of the Scandinavian countries, certainly the impression I'm getting, is that they do more and measure less, maybe. And sometimes we maybe need to think, well, actually, we don't need to measure everything. We can have faith in what we're doing. I think the evidence is there. We just go and do it.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think it kind of links to what you were saying, Roger. But I think in, for example, Scandinavia, like this kind of health and well-being culture is more ingrained in what they do as standard. So in some ways there is less need for an assessment method because it's something that kind of they may do more without, like you said, necessarily having to measure it at all. It's kind of something that it is done and kind of thought about in a slightly different way. I think in the US there is a lot of assessment methods, and those kind of ways of thinking is very popular there. And I think just specifically on things like kind of operational health and well-being, if we're thinking in like workplaces, for example, for the WELL standard, there are loads of requirements on making sure that you get benefit for giving your employers good annual leave and maternity cover and sick leave and all those kind of things. And it's like, even in the UK context, that is actually, in a lot of places, legal requirements, but also like just kind of standard practice, and that is accepted. But in some places, like for example, the USA, that isn't necessarily a given. So there is room in some areas, in some other places like the US, where having this kind of standard that says, well, actually, this is what you need to do to show, and these are ideas and things that you can put in place. It kind of acts as a tool, I suppose, for kind of employers and kind of developers to use to enable to kind of inform their decisions, I suppose.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. So our next question. This is for Kat and Tunde, so get ready. Who or what type of client/building owners are undertaking wellbeing assessments? How do we encourage more people to want to undertake these assessments? Can it be a sales pitch to employees or building users?
Do you want to go, Tunde? You go. I'll talk directly.
Well, we can both go anyway. I think if we take a step back really and trace it historically to the early adopters of the well-being standards, they were generally developers of commercial workspaces that wanted to differentiate themselves in the market, and they've used it as a market leverage, if you like. And then there are other developers who not just wanted to use it as a marketing credential, but also as something they really care about. It's part of their organizational DNA, because they wanted to see great outcomes, and they want to see the benefits of what their products or their buildings and developments provide to tenants, if you like. I know one of such organizations, and they actually created a new office, a role within their organization for a chief wellbeing officer, which is quite amazing. It's because they really cared, about the subject, and they've seen the importance of it. Like I said in my presentation, that we've seen priorities change, at various levels, even at organization and board levels. There we're seeing, well-being being placed as a key priority. There is a global real estate sustainability benchmarking tool which investors use to assess risks, across property portfolios. And about 5 years ago, the health and well-being was introduced as a module, in that particular assessment. So the initial adopters were, sort of developers and owners of workspaces, and we're seeing further, sort of drivers coming from tenants who actually want better spaces, and as a result of that, even speculative, developers that do speculative developments are actually thinking of making well-ready buildings. So buildings that have health and well-being, as key consideration. So it means that when tenants who are really interested in taking this up to the next level want to take ownership of such spaces or demise within the buildings, they're not disenfranchised. They're not prevented. They're not limited in any way. So yeah, initially it was key developers that had well-being as a key objective and driver, and those that also saw it as a marketing opportunity. And then of course we've seen further push from big tenants that that they want to attract and retain the best talents in the market, and they feel that having healthy workplaces would be a great way to go.
I think I'll just add to that, Tunde, really, that I think definitely now we are seeing much more of a push from tenants than we used to do, for sure, because the kind of new the new workforce coming into, well, the office at some point or at home, whatever, but like, in their kind of work environment, the new workforce coming through are almost expecting a healthy work-life balance that is more kind of expected as standard than it used to be. So employers are really looking at ways that they can show, and like Tunde said, retain good talent, to say, like, look, this is a great place to work. These are the things we've got going for us. And this is why we're different from our competitors. This is why you should work for us. So I kind of, in a way, Sarah, you just say, can it be a sales pitch? And I suppose it kind of is a sales pitch in a way, but kind of, making, I think the key thing we need to do really to encourage more people to do it is really, just by shouting about those benefits, because you can say you've got a well gold rated building, which is great, and it kind of is an easy badge, and it's a good thing for marketing, a quick marketing. But I think what we really need to do is market the on the ground benefits. That, so like, you can have a well gold rating, but actually what that means is that you get a flexible work-life balance, you get great indoor air quality, you get great light, daylight, and access to nature. And I think shouting about those benefits is really how you encourage people to do them. And I think that's where we get the most traction, for sure, is when we have kind of clients coming in that are like, I really want to get I really want a healthy building, but I don't know where to start. And we can kind of show them those benefits, and how, and something like Well or Fit Well, for example, is a kind of a good easy place to start, I suppose, in terms of using a kind of design framework for them to help get them running.
I think that's right. I mean, my own experience of working in health settings with NHS and other care provider clients is that they initially get involved because of direct and particular benefits which they see external spaces can deliver to their stakeholder clients, their patients. But the more we open up the conversation, it becomes clear that they can save money with reduced drug regimes. They can retain staff, quality staff, with better environments. Some of the places that we ask hard-pressed medics to live and work in are beyond belief. They're almost torture chambers. Outdoor gravel courtyards with nothing in them at all, not a plant in sight, very rarely anything to sit down on, is where these people grab their rest in between saving our lives in pandemics. So they see the potential to retain those staff. They see the potential to not have to pay for staff being sick the whole time because of the places that they live in. So I totally agree with Tunde and Katherine. It's all about benefit. You've just got to make benefits which people never dreamt of, make them aware of those things as being win-win situations, and you know that happens all the way, cascades right down to primary healthcare, where you know now I work with an increasing number of GP surgeries that have well-being coordinators, but rather than paying millions every year for more and more drugs from Pfizer and SmithKline Beecham, they buy a minibus, they buy a member of staff who knows exactly where all the different conservation and green space projects are going on, and they drive around all the people in the community of patients to the surgery who have got, you know, issues to do with depression, obesity, other stress-related conditions that manifest as physical ailments, but the doctor knows full well are about, you know, fear of accessing the environment or lack of exercise or whatever. They get them out to those places, they meet people and socialize, they drop them back at the end of the day, they've saved money on drugs, you know, they've made friends, and you know, they've created people with healthier lives who are not drug dependent, but have become instruments of their own, you know, their own solution. So I totally agree with Tunde and Katherine. It's about opening up notions of benefit that the client organization had no idea were there to access.
Thank you, guys. Our final question is from Alex. So again, spotlight is back on Kat and Tunde, I'm afraid. Have the Hoare Lea team worked with Building with Nature scheme?
I think the answer for that is very short. Oh yes, we have. And I think I responded to that in the chat group as well. I'm quite, I feel quite privileged to be leading on one of such schemes in Swansea. Like I said in the chat, it's one of my favorite projects. It's called Biophilic Leaving. And this is by ASA Developments, you know, and this is looking at an existing site, retaining most of it, but building on top of it and behind it into an existing car park space, and it's right in the heart of the city, and it's looking at reimagining how we live in urban environments. It's got about 5-6 stories of urban farming integrated into the facade, green walls. It's got hydroponics as well integrated in it. You've got PVs, and it's great because it's not just farming, which is just there. It's actually a social. It's got a social purpose as well to it, because it's going to be owned by the owners of the developments. So it's kind of like a cooperative, if you like. So they plant and grow food that they eat and they sell as well. And that there's just so much, you know, in that building, you know, to be honest. The rainwater is extensively harvested and reused to, you know, water, you know, all of the landscaping, you know, roof terraces and roof garden, you know, lots of amenity spaces created in there. It's such a fantastic building. I think it's also won the Welsh government's innovative housing program funding as well, just because of the level of innovation involved. And then we got Swansea University research fellows involved on the project, and a vast array of other, you know, consultants and specialists, you know, as you would imagine. You know, the goal is water is not wasted in that scheme. Everything is reused and recirculated. It's all about the circular economy. There's a closed loop, you know, I think it was you, Michael, who said you don't want to break the circle, you know, and I think that's the kind of goal that's, you know, been trying to achieve on that. And it's probably going to be the first scheme, you know, in Wales to have WELL certification. Fingers crossed.
Wow.
That sounds really cool. You're going to have to invite us all along. So everybody who's attended, all of the panelists, we need to go and see it when it's complete. That sounds
Oh,
great.
absolutely. Something we should organise. It would be my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists today. I'm going to tell you all a little bit about our next webinar, as well as another event that we have coming up. So if you give me 2 seconds, everybody, I'll just share my screen so you can read as I talk. So one of our partners, as many of you know, is Low Carbon Devon. So they have a Sustainable Earth 2021 event on between the 24th and the 25th of June. Obviously, there's a lot of information on this slide, but if you are interested, just Google it. It'll be a really interesting talk. Registration is free. There's lots of great speakers. So that will definitely be something to whet your appetite. And then, of course, I'm coming on to our next webinar. So a date for your diaries, the 19th of May, same time. We will be talking about future housing for Plymouth. So this is going to be actually a really good webinar, just as good as this one. We're going to be talking to Alistair McPherson from Plymouth Energy Community. He's going to be returning, so some of you have seen him before. He's going to tell us more about the green homes investment and the new build zero carbon housing projects happening in Plymouth. Rob Wheaton from Stride Tregowan will talk us through a low carbon housing project which assessed carbon, nature and construction impacts forming the Future Homes Standard. And Paul from Homes England will join us to talk about how they're looking to drive construction innovation and unlock difficult sites whilst seeking to work holistically with nature to create beautiful, sustainable places to live. So do join us for that one. And thank you everybody for attending today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar.
That you taught to hold your breath. All those words that I think I said I meant to you before we left. And the way you